But let me go ahead and begin. I'm a sociologist by training, so a little bit of a sociological background. What do we mean by minority groups? Minority groups suffer subordination and discrimination within a society. So women, gays, the elderly are often called minorities. In practice, we typically call minorities groups whose subordination is based on such factors as race, ethnicity, religion, and national origin. One defining factor in minority groups is that they share a common identity. There is a sense of we-ness versus the world, and are conscious of their subordinate status. In U.S. sociological minorities are usually African-Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asian and Pacific Islanders. We can talk about Jewish Americans also as possibly an ethnic minority. They're not socioeconomically disadvantaged, and we don't really talk very much about them. There's not a whole lot of good research really on the Jewish American population. With respect to the development of the field, many of you know that gerontology is really a recent field. It really picked up pace in the 1940s with the Gerontological Society and the American Geriatric Society. And in the beginning, the research focused on the non-Hispanic white population that was by far the most dominant population in numbers and otherwise. With respect to minority aging, African Americans, for good reasons, received attention first. They were by far the largest. And the field really originated in the attempts of certain advocacy groups, not intellectuals, not scholars, not academics, but advocacy groups during the civil rights era to highlight the disadvantaged position of African American older people in the 1960s. And out of that came a double jeopardy hypothesis that kind of has, in many ways, dominated the field, which basically says that if you're African American and you're old, you got two things against you. You're doubly disadvantaged. And some people extended this to say, well, you know, if you're African American or minority, and you're old, and you're a woman, and you're poor, you know, there's a quadruple problem there. But if we stay with the double jeopardy hypothesis for a minute, people in the 70s suggested that disparities in middle age between blacks and whites, let's say in this case, should increase in old age, right? Because they become old and therefore they are doubly disadvantaged than middle-aged people. Now, when you actually look at the data, cross-sectional data, which many people looked at that time, the health disparities between minority groups and the majority decline from middle age to old age, partly in the African-American case because of early selective survival. In other words, the weakest people in the minority groups that don't have the best access, they live in harsh environments, die earlier, and therefore the ones who survive to very advanced old years tend to be healthier. And I'll come back to that later, and the literature talks about a mortality crossover phenomenon that takes place. So if you live to be 90 and you're African American, then you're healthier from then on and you live longer than non-Hispanic whites. That doesn't really mean there's an advantage there. It means there's a real disadvantage in the population in that, you know, if aging kills you earlier or removes you from the picture. Incomes also decline between minority and majority groups from middle age to old age, again for good reasons, because minority groups don't make a whole lot to begin with, so they don't drop as much. That is kind of misleading, however, because a better measure of socioeconomic status and financial resources is net worth in old age, because if you look at net worth figures rather than income figures, minority groups are like 15, 20%. Their net worth is maybe 20% of the non-Hispanic white population. And you know, net worth is very important in terms of, you know, securing your health and your life as you get older. The other thing that makes older minority members better off than middle-aged members sometimes is the insurance situation. Hispanics and African Americans in middle age are very underinsured. And when they get to be old, they have Medicare. Okay, not all Hispanics do, but 93% do, and African Americans in higher numbers. So that's better than having nothing. With respect to numbers, the latest projections from the census, if we look at the 2000 census, you see that the non-Hispanic white population in 2000 was 196. It's growing very slow. In 50 years, it only goes up to 210. The African American, the Hispanic population goes from 35 in 2000 to 103 million, maybe even more. You know, we underestimated the numbers in our projections earlier, and now the Hispanic population in 2004 is really very close to 40 million. But it's going to triple in 2 generations. The African American population also grows rapidly, but not as rapidly as the Hispanic. And the Asian origin population, in this slide, and we're just talking about Asian origin populations, not Pacific Islanders, which are included in the other. They're going to triple. And again, they're tripling primarily because of immigration. Now, the Hispanic population is growing because of immigration and also high fertility in most of the Hispanic groups. And the other races also are increasing rapidly, and you can see Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, and 2 or more races, which is not a huge number, but a lot of people pick 2 or more races on the census form, and a group that demands some attention. With respect to the mortality patterns of the African American, we've known for a long time. They don't live as long. They have higher mortality rates at every age, except when you get to 85 plus or 90 plus, depending on who you talk to and who is writing. And there's some arguments again here about the quality of the data. But I think the majority of the field feels that there is a mortality crossover that takes place. In other words, if you live to be 85, you're African American, you have a higher life expectancy than the non-Hispanic white person at the same age. And again, that's a selective survival kind of explanation. Okay, the weak kind of die earlier and so on. People who are very obese, people who have heart disease, stroke or whatever, these things strike earlier in the minority groups and they die younger. High infant mortality rates continue to be a problem. As many of you know, infant mortality rates have been coming down in all groups. They remain double among African Americans than the non-Hispanic white population. Now, what are the risk profiles? Well, you know, most people, African Americans, or the majority, I should say, you know, live in poverty or poor living environments. Discrimination has always been a factor that is talked about, especially in studies of hypertension. You know, there is some evidence suggesting that indeed that might be part of the picture, if not all of the picture with respect to hypertension. Access to medical care, we talked about insurance earlier, availability of services in the inner city and elsewhere. High rates of hypertension, we know that's a big problem, and a lot of people are paying attention to that. High rates of obesity, especially among women, not so much among men. Diet and nutrition are brought out. The African American population, despite its many problems, when older people become old, their suicide rates tend to be very low, and there may be some cultural factors behind that we can talk about. Another problem is the high homicide rates. We're not talking about old people here, we're talking about the general population. HIV is a problem, it's a major cause of death, not in the top 4 or 5, but in the top 12. Then we also talk about strong families, of course, in African Americans. And here, you know, you may get some divided opinions about what that means, but there is reliance on the elderly sometimes by the children. A lot of older African Americans raise their grandchildren because their children are not able to or are in trouble. But on the other hand, there is a sense of family, there is a sense of community, and the church is a very important institution that gives supports to individuals and especially the older people. Disability or functional limitations, disability rates are high based on a variety of surveys and studies that have been going on for many years. Again, no surprise here. Also, there is a tendency to assess your health as poor if you're African American, and you know, this is kind of a powerful variable in us who do research on aging because it's very predictive. You know, it means a lot. It has a lot of meaning. Predicts mortality, predicts other things down the road. With respect to mental health, depression is not really clear whether it's higher or lower. In old age, some studies show no difference. Some studies show African Americans worse and sometimes better. With Alzheimer's disease, there is new evidence coming out from the North Manhattan study that includes Hispanics of Caribbean origin and also African Americans. And there's a big study going on in Chicago by our colleague Dennis Evans that is beginning to suggest that maybe, yeah, there is more of a problem here, more Alzheimer's disease in African Americans than the general population. Now, traditionally, up to just recent years, we say, well, you know, the number and percent of African American older people who end up in nursing homes is lower than the non-Hispanic white population. Something happened in the late 90s, and things have been reversed, so you have more African Americans in nursing homes now than non-Hispanic whites, and the reason is because out there people, you know, why? The white rates have fallen. Why have they fallen? Nursing home rates.
Because of assisted living.
Assisted living and other options. So, and African Americans don't have those options to the same extent. They don't have the resources to. Assisted living is expensive, and it's not always covered by insurance. So that's a new thing, and it's something that we haven't really looked at in the literature with research to find out what is going on. And of course, many of you probably are familiar with nursing home issues, quality, and that varies among various ethnic groups, and availability of, you know, good facilities in the communities. But anyway, the rates of African Americans are higher now, and not a whole lot, but something to look at and think about. Now, you know, the largest minority population now is, as you know, the Hispanic population. These are numbers from percents from 2002, estimates, not the census, but estimates from the current population survey that the Census Bureau does every year or two, and to update census figures. You'll see that the Mexican origin population is about 2/3. It continues to be by far the largest. We are saying in recent years, hey, you know, the people coming from all over, they're coming from Central America, South America, Caribbean, and so on, but they're still coming from Mexico in larger numbers. So it's still by far the largest, and in my estimate, it's going to be the largest in the future, unless, you know, the socio-political environment and economic issues and terrorism, whatever world issues might change that. But as far as we can tell, that's likely to remain the largest population. Central and South Americans, if you will lump them here, they're somewhat different. Puerto Ricans, and then Cubans, and then other Hispanics. The other Hispanics, when I show you disability data, they look amazingly like Mexican origins, older people, at least the older people. And we think that many of those are actually Mexican origin, but they don't check on the census for Mexican because they may think that's not cool, or they may check something like other Hispanic. I'm not Mexican, even though I may be from Mexico. Now, with respect to the socioeconomic conditions, we know that the Hispanic population does not do as well. This is education, and I can show you income and other things than the non-Hispanic white population. When you look at the educational data among the various groups, Tony talked about the diversity of these Hispanic groups, that the Mexican origin population seems to be the worst off educationally and income-wise. Let's get to the Hispanic mortality patterns. Now, one thing that I'm going to talk about this a little later is, despite the socioeconomic disadvantage of Hispanics, most Hispanics, the Cubans, not really, and some other groups, but the majority, the Mexican origin, the Puerto Ricans, they're very disadvantaged socioeconomically. They're like African Americans in their educational status, income, But we feel like or the literature feels out there that they live longer than the rest of us. Not just the African Americans, but they live longer than the non-Hispanic white population, which kind of doesn't make sense. And many of us are trying to figure out what's going on. Is it something wrong with the data? I mean, there's still a lot of talk about that. Some of the data are bad, like vital statistics, mortality data are based on death certificates, right? And then enumerations by the census. And death certificates, we know that there are problems because of misclassification of ethnicity, of nursing homes, a lot of Hispanics. The funeral director puts down white because they can't tell the difference. It's a huge problem with African Americans, I mean with American Indians, because many of them are really white looking, and if you're not on the reservation and you're American Indian living in LA and the funeral director puts out, this person looks white and has a white name, so huge problem there. So, but there are other data that we have where we follow people over time with these large surveys that the government does, and we have the National Death Index, and we kind of have better information. That data shows also that the Hispanic groups, including Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, the least advantaged, seem to be living longer, or at least as long as a non-Hispanic white. So what are the components of this disadvantage? Diabetes is a big one, high death rates from diabetes, and also death rates from other factors that diabetes correlates with, like stroke and heart disease, although the overall stroke and heart disease and cancer mortality rates of most Hispanic groups appear to be lower. And Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, the Cuban American population, the older generation, they're white, European origin, different class, diabetes rates are not as high. Puerto Ricans have the high total mortality rates in New York City that are higher than in Puerto Rico or elsewhere, and this is primarily because of higher homicide and cirrhosis of the liver. Something has changed in Puerto Rico, however, recently. I don't know if you've been following the media. Their homicide rate is the highest in the country, in San Juan, in other parts of Puerto Rico. It's a huge, huge problem. So that slide is probably outdated, and we need to get an update on that. It is a major problem. Now, with respect to accidents, Mexican Americans have higher mortality from accidents, but lower suicide rates than Puerto Ricans and Cubans. And the suicide rate that is low in old age in Mexican Americans may have something to do with, you know, the place of the older person in the extended family, the community, religion, and so on. Now, with Hispanic elderly, we talked about high life expectancy. And even when you get old, at age 65, life expectancy seems to be still higher than the rest of the population. There's obesity. That is a problem in the population. Obesity is really a problem in middle age and young age that predicts negative outcomes. If you're obese and you're 65, 70, 80, we're finding in our data that it's not as good a predictor of mortality. In fact, it's protective of mortality, even though Soham Al-Sini is finding out that very obese people are more likely to become disabled over time. Low rates of institutionalization. Definitely here, about 2 or 3% instead of 5 or 6% in other groups. It hasn't gone up. You might speculate that it might go up as things change. And one of the things that is going on with the Hispanic population and the Mexican origin population, they're moving away from the Southwest, and they're moving in very large numbers to other parts of the country, including the Southeast. Some of these are immigrants that are coming directly from Mexico. Some of them moving from the Southwest. So there may be issues about, okay, the older people left behind, will they lose supports? Something to think about. I said earlier they have Medicare, minority groups have Medicare, yeah, 92% maybe, we think, in old age among the Mexican origin population, let's say. But that's a lot lower than the rest of the country. And a lot of those people are recent immigrants, you know, they don't qualify yet. They come to be with their children because their children are here, and they have declining health possibly, so they come over. We don't know very much about those people. We think that number of people coming from Mexico in their older years is going up based on recent census. And we're actually in our Hispanic EPI study trying to get a better handle on that by asking questions and paying more attention to older people that move to this country in their older years. Now, self-assessed health, we talked about that. Also, they assess their health as poorer. And they're more disabled. I think I mentioned that earlier. And again, they live longer, but with more disability and more problems, right? So there is kind of a paradox there, too. With respect to mental health, we think that there is probably high rates of depression, especially among women. And part of the problem in minority groups, depression, in certain cultural groups, it may be kind of explained as part of normal aging by the family, and therefore not seek treatment. And we know depression is highly treatable with medications. Not that I'm advocating that, but it does help a lot of people. And so it may be tolerated more and hidden by the family. With respect to Alzheimer's disease, we don't know for sure. The Caribbean origin Hispanics being studied in the North Manhattan study appear to have more genetic predisposition. That's because of their African-American ancestry primarily. The Mexican-American people, we don't really know. There is a new study in Sacramento area, longitudinal study of aging, which is suggesting that possibly Mexican-Americans also may be more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. This is all in very early stage of research, so we don't know. There used to be a theory in the literature that Hispanic elderly don't really go to the doctor or the hospital because it's a foreign institution. That's just not the case. They do go to the doctor. There's a great respect for their physician, and we, thank God, are having more and more physicians who are Hispanic. UTMB is the leader in that. So they do go to the doctor, and there's a lot of respect. And they have Medicare, and that's why they go to the doctor. They don't go to curanderos. I mean, some do, but very few. This is the epidemiologic paradox I mentioned earlier that a colleague and I suggested back in the mid-'80s when we looked through the literature. And Hispanics, except for the Cuban, they're socioeconomically advantaged, disadvantaged, but they have favorable overall mortality rates. It's paradoxical because we know that socioeconomic factors are major correlates of health outcomes like mortality. So, okay, then we look at the risk for whites. Well, they have high rates of diabetes. Diabetes is going up. It's a devastating disease, causes disability, and it causes cardiovascular problems down the road. And they have high rates of obesity throughout the life course, which correlate with late life outcomes, like mortality and also disability. Rates of hypertension and cholesterol within they're about the same as a non-Hispanic white population, so that doesn't explain. Smoking rates are going up, and I think now they're stabilizing, and they're high among men and low among women. But the population, by and large, the Mexican origin, they smoke fewer cigarettes, and that's a significant factor. That doesn't mean that it's not a problem, but it's fewer cigarettes than other groups, and Cuban Americans smoke the most. Now, there is alcohol consumption. It's an interesting area because Hispanic groups like Puerto Ricans and Mexican origin people, let's say, do not drink as frequently as the non-Hispanic population, but when they drink more, okay? It's been referred to in Mexican studies and also in this country as a fiesta pattern, where you don't drink until when you go to the fiesta, and then you drink a whole lot. And so there is binge drinking that can be problematic, and I'm glad to see there are people paying attention to that now. In the old people, it's not a problem, especially among women. They don't drink. They never drank, most of them, in these traditional Hispanic groups like Mexican Americans. But younger women, as they become more acculturated, they're drinking more. It remains to be seen how much of that is problem drinking. Another factor that is a risk factor is low rates of physical activity, especially among older people. These are people who worked in physical labor, many of them, all of their lives. Now they retire and they earn their leisure. And they don't play tennis or go bungee jumping or whatever. And they become physically inactive. And that's a terrible thing for diabetics, because I'm told by my physician friends and exercise physiologists and I read that it's very important if you're diabetic to remain physically active and socially active and not be depressed. We're finding in our study that depressed diabetics are really in trouble because they're much more likely to die and become disabled. Complications down the road, because if you're depressed, you're not going to take care of your diabetes, you're not going to be very active physically and socially, and you're going to decline faster. We always talk about strong families as a positive factor, but we have never really been able to link strong families and really mortality rates that are lower in this population in a big way, okay, in a big way, in a big systematic way. It's kind of like a residual carry. Yeah, they live longer because they take care of each other and they have good families. Well, they're not always that strong, the families. They got problems too. But there is a lot of reliance on the family in many of these groups. What we ended up with back in '86 when we published the first paper on the paradox was migration selection. There is a healthy immigrant effect. When people move to other countries, they're kind of selected health-wise, they're healthy enough to move. Sometimes Mexican families get together and pick the best, or maybe the healthiest, the most capable person in the family to send to Los Angeles to work and send money back to the family. So that's a selection process there too. We know that all immigrant groups in this country today and in Europe and Australia, and I reviewed this extensively, are healthier, and they tend to be selected. And immigrants are people, we think of them as the lowest of the low, they're poor and uneducated, but they're people who want to improve their lives, and that's consistent, I think, with good health and longevity. And so migration selection is, in my mind, and the best explanation why certain populations tend to be healthier. I'm still not sold on the idea that Mexican Americans live longer. I still think there are some issues we're trying to resolve. But they live longer than African Americans, probably. That's probably true. Now, the Asian Pacific and Pacific Islander, a different story. As a group, and most of them are Asian origin, the Pacific Islander group is really disadvantaged, and I'll show you data later. But we lump them sometimes like this. And the healthier population in this country, okay? Again, they're selected as immigrants. They're also socioeconomically selected too. And the second generations here, the Japanese and the Chinese, they make more money and they have more resources and do better on the average. They have low disability rates, favorable, and I'll show you some later, favorable self-ratings of health. There is great within group heterogeneity here, okay? And we talk about heterogeneity in the Hispanic population here. You got 26 groups. And you have some really disadvantaged groups like Cambodian and Hmong refugees and so on. And again, they have lower Medicare coverage, again, because there are a lot of recent immigrants, especially, the Vietnamese. We're all familiar with the Vietnamese migration, where, older people came over. And there's some issues there too, with the Asian groups, because their kids move up socioeconomically. They go to medical school. I mean, in large numbers, they have done very well as a group. And I'm not going to stereotype, not everybody does well, but on the average, the Vietnamese and other Asian groups have shown tremendous mobility socioeconomically from the parents. And a lot of the parents actually were people who were professionals but could not work professionally in the country. One problem with some of these Asian groups, and I've seen some recent evidence, let's say Asian groups, people from India, right? Recent immigration in large numbers, and people bring their parents after they move here. what happens here? A lot of these people live in the Silicon Valley, right? You know, engineers and computer scientists, and their parents move in with them. Well, they live in suburbia. They don't live in barrios like Mexican Americans do, where they have a protective environment, and they can speak the language, or you know, they have organizations. So they tend to be isolated, and after a few years, we notice that the younger generations advance, and they adapt, and they're less depressed, and the older people do worse over time. So something that the small studies out there, but not in a big way to really examine the very, very interesting phenomenon and find ways to make it better. What can we say about Native American elderly? The mortality, the official mortality rates that I've shown my students and others before, show them to really live, they have much lower rates, and it makes no sense. Part of it is a problem I mentioned earlier, the misclassification of ethnicity on the death certificate. When we correct for that and look at other data, and really look at people who are American Indians only, not some of my friends were like 1/16th American Indian, and now all of a sudden they're American Indian and non-Hispanic white, because the census allows them. If you look at the primarily American Indian and Native American people who identify as such, they're in trouble. They still have problems. Okay, their mortality rates are worse, maybe not as bad as some other groups, but they're worse. And then they have high rates of disability, high rates of diabetes, because of the American Indian admixture in many of the tribes, okay? And that's why Mexican Americans have high rates of diabetes, because of the American Indian admixture. That's one of the problems. Genetic predisposition, in addition to other behavioral and obesity and other factors. You all hear about alcohol problems on the reservations. It's true. It's not a big problem with old people, because people with problems have already died by and large, many of them, and not all of them. And they have a high rate of accidents, major cause of death on the reservation, like the Navajo reservation, for example. Alcohol is part of it, the bad roads and bad cars. And these are highly correctable problems in the American Indian population, and not necessarily the older people. Now, with respect to policy, and we think about the minorities or ethnicity, you know, there are a lot of issues going on here, and I just put down a few. You know, we think there are generational changes in educational attainment. So let's say the next generations that are more educated, when they're going to be old, they're going to be better off, because education is a great resource that correlates with so many other things. On the other hand, when you look at the migration patterns of the Mexican origin population, for example, today, you get a continued influx of less educated immigrants or illegal, undocumented people who end up staying here. So there is the likelihood that the population will continue to be disadvantaged for a long time, even though a lot of people will move to the middle and the upper classes. And you see that in the media and in President Bush's appointments to cabinet. You know, there are just more and more people who have done well and are going to do well in the future. I talked earlier about a problem, I alluded to it, is the younger generations become acculturated, assimilated, they speak English and they get good jobs, and the older people stay behind, they're different. There are some issues there, in some frictions that we identified in some of the Asian groups and also the Hispanic groups. There are declining mortality and fertility in most groups that may also cause more rapid aging. We expect that to happen. As you know, there's a huge debate about what to do with Social Security now, and I think Bush wants to push his plan, and a lot of people are against that. The debate on Social Security and Medicare is very important to minority populations, because most of them really rely on Social Security for their livelihood and Medicare for their health insurance. A big field in aging in the last 20 years has been the study of caregiving. Because of the population getting older, we got Alzheimer's disease all over the place, we got disability, somebody has to take care of older people who are disabled, and families do most of that. It's not the nursing homes, it's families that do that. And so there's a lot of problems associated with caregiving burden on daughters, spouses, primarily women. We haven't really done that in a big way with the Hispanic population. We have some studies. I'm just saying, throwing that out as an opportunity for research for people who are interested. The structure of caregiving may be different, where it's shared by more people. The typical caregiver person in the Anglo, not Hispanic, is one person, right? In the Hispanic family, maybe the daughters sharing that, or daughters and spouses. Getting a better handle of that would really be important. The other thing about caregiving in minority groups, because of cultural values that say you gotta take care of your older person, and if you're the daughter or spouse, you may end up quitting your job and move, or not move, but move in and take care of your mother or father because you don't want to put them in a nursing home. Well, you're not in the labor force earning money and earning pensions and Social Security for your old age. We think that's real. It's a problem, and we don't have specific numbers, but I think that's something to be investigated. We talk about minority groups as having larger and more supportive networks. Again, some people might argue whether larger is always better, because larger sometimes becomes a burden. And we talk about co-residence with children, let's say in Hispanics, right? Sometimes that's just because of no other options. So older people will move in with children. They don't necessarily want to when we ask them in our studies, but they have no other choice. Another thing that's going on in minority communities and continues to be an issue is, and really in the world in general, in this country, not just minorities, AIDS and drug abuse sometimes lead to dependence of the younger middle-aged people on the older people. And that's something to be investigated. Since 1990, the United States Census long form, 5% sample, has asked these, I guess the 6 questions, assessing disability in, they call the first one sensory. So whoever fills out the form, is for every person, they're going to say, is it blindness, deafness, severe vision impairment in this person, right? And they're going to mark it down, yes or no. Now, you can argue that this is subjective. A lot of our data are subjective. Some of the reliability, validity studies have been done with these kinds of items. They seem reasonable. Better than nothing. Okay, so we're learning from them. So, and the advantage here is the census is 300 million people almost now, right? 282 in 2000. Even 5% is millions of people. So we have a lot of numbers in each ethnic group, and I'll show you some. And to my surprise, maybe not to my surprise, the patterns that show up in these disability rates are what we expected from the more limited, smaller studies we did here, the Southwest, in Southeast, some national studies, and so on. And I urge you to think about that. We have a team of people. Arlene, Katie is one of them, Carl Eschbach, Max, and I, and others, Soham probably, who are very interested in disability. We want to look at the census because of just the large numbers and do some, I think, very, very, very useful descriptive work that is going to really give us good, stable estimates of some of these problems that people have out there. This is for everybody, not just older people. I'm going to show you some data just on older people. Now, and you see A and B. B is a physical disability, so they're asking about condition that limits basic physical activities such as walking, climbing stairs, reaching, lifting, carrying. Some of them are kind of like ADLs or IADLs, depending on how you look at them, that we're familiar with. Then there's something that they call mental. I would have called that cognitive, but anyway, the census says mental. That's learning, remembering, and concentrating. Um, and, you know, older people, their daughters or whoever fills this out, sometimes they overestimate the problems that older people have. We know that proxies sometimes do that. In proxy interviews, when we interview a spouse or a child, they tend to think of their parents as really in worse shape than they really are. But nevertheless, and then there's the self-care, which is really very similar to at least addressing and bathing to the activities of daily living that we're familiar with. And then being able to get around inside the house and outside the house. They call that self-care. And going outside the home alone to shop or visit a doctor's office, kind of like IADLs, instrumental activities of daily living. Working at a job or business, I'm not going to show you anything there because I think this is really biased when it comes to older people. It may be a lot of misleading checks by members. Well, they're not working, they've been retired for many years, so it's not an issue for the vast majority of older people. So these are the items. I'm going to show you some data, and I apologize. It's not as bad as it looks. Hey, I can come over here. These are people in the early 60s, 65 to 69. What is that? Well, I'm sorry, 70 to 74, 75 to 70, and this is 80 plus, right? That's where you expect most of the disability. Well, what patterns do you see? Okay, this is men, non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics slightly more disabled, African Americans more, and Native Americans even more, right? Look at the Asian American population, right? Down. They're separate from the Pacific Islanders here. Pacific Islanders are really kind of like American Indians, genetically and in their health profiles, socioeconomically. These are the native Hawaiians, Guamanians, Samoans, and so on that live in Pacific. And they have high rates of diabetes, very similar to obesity. So the problem, even with a large census database of 5%, their numbers, especially when you get to the very old, they're just a few hundred, okay? They're not that many, so their rates for them are not as stable. But what do you see here? African Americans, way up there. Native Americans, maybe even higher. This is having any of those disabilities that I listed down for you, 6 of them, right? I'll show you some specific, well, this is women. It's the same thing, very much. Women are more disabled, by the way, than men. We know that from previous work. Similar patterns. This is taking care of yourself, self-care, like bathing, grooming, and so on. What do we see? Again, the non-Hispanic whites do better. Asian Americans, very similar. Hispanics as a group, I'm going to show you later the various Hispanic origins, and you see some interesting differences. Again, African Americans worse off, Native Americans worse off, and at every of the 5-year age groups, and especially in the 80 plus. Now, this is women, again, the same pattern. Women, again, they're worse off. Pacific Islanders shoot up in the very old. Again, the numbers are an issue there. There are not as many of them in the sample. This is disability of being able to get around the house and go outside. And again, you see Hispanics worse off as a group, African Americans worse off than whites also, Native Americans by and large worse off. And again, the Asian American population seems to be pretty close to non-Hispanic white, and the Pacific Islanders worse off. Now, these are women, again, pretty much, you see that how much higher the women's rates are. They're pretty much the same story with African Americans and Hispanics being more disabled, and Native Americans also. And Asian Americans seem to be doing a little worse than the non-Hispanic whites here, but the Pacific Islanders worse. This is a physical disability and a medical condition that keeps you from doing things or whatever the phrasing was earlier. Again, in the physical disability, you see that non-Hispanic whites are fine. Hispanics are actually pretty close here, and the Asian Americans are really better off, again, African Americans and Native Americans. They're worse off of the major groups. These are women, pretty much the same story, with the Asian American women being in better shape. This is mental disability, what I actually call cognitive, being able to concentrate and remember and so on. And here again, the Native Americans seem to be worst off. Non-Hispanic whites and Asian Americans are the best off, and African Americans and Hispanics worse than average. In women, the same story by and large. So I'll move to sensory. This is like blindness, deafness, hearing problems, right? Remember those? And look at the Native Americans who are way up there. One thing you will notice here, maybe Tony can help me with this. Tony, I'm sorry I'm sitting in front of you because he's done his research on sensory impairment, especially blindness. African Americans do not seem to be doing as bad in this category. And research by my former student David Lee and others, and your literature review and publications, there's something about African Americans when it comes to vision and hearing, and maybe they're not as bad off as they should be, based on their socioeconomic situation. Something to be looked at. But look at Native Americans. This is the first time I've seen this. And I don't know that there are any big Native American studies of vision and hearing problems that are going on. There are not many Native American studies that are intensively looking at this problem. Arlene?
Could some of this sensory stuff, it includes sight, right? Could some
Yeah, sight.
Native Americans would do complications from diabetes? Would that be
Yeah, that's possible. And also you can say that about Hispanics. Although the Native American prevalence of diabetes is higher in most groups, so that may in fact explain why they are so much higher. But what about the African Americans being lower though? They have diabetes too. But with the Native Americans, it is so remarkably higher. It needs to be studied, and I'm not sure anybody's doing it. Is there a Native American eye study? I don't know of one.
No, there's really not. And the biggest problem is that just getting the numbers.
Yeah.
And I think it's a similar situation as some of the other disability issues where the numbers just aren't real stable to Native Americans. With African Americans, if you go with, if you want to just look at the vision, that the major health condition with African Americans is glaucoma.
Right.
And so what's happening with there is that there's been a big push to get earlier detection with glaucoma, and they've come a long way with medication treatment that they catch early. So personally, I think in the long run that's making a difference with that particular condition among African Americans. They haven't had that same success with diabetic retinopathy, which is why I think you see it more in the Hispanic populations, and you're seeing similar rates with the non-Hispanic whites, not because of diabetes, but because of macular degeneration, which is more prominent well, there's still kind of a question about it, but it is more prominent than the other, among non-Hispanic whites than other ethnic groups, the macular degeneration. And there's not a lot of extra treatment for that as well, effective treatment.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah. All of these are opportunities. You know, this is like descriptive information. There are opportunities for new research, whether it's epidemiologic or, because there are problems with these questions I mentioned earlier. So they're not giving us all the answers. Intensive studies where you go and actually give eye exams to people, you know, or hearing exams, or disability performance measures like we do in our study. There's a lot of room for studying, and these groups are growing, okay? And need to be studied. These are women, sensory disability, same story. Again, African Americans seem to be doing better than Hispanics and non-Hispanics white. These are...
So the sensory disability is a combination of both, hearing and visual.
Yeah, yes.
To break that down, how do they do?
I think they do better in both. I mean, the African Americans do slightly better in both, and possibly Hispanics, but don't quote me on that yet, but because I like to kind of look back at the papers.
The disability with sensory with hearing is really, then you have to look at it as that with uncorrected hearing.
Right, right.
And then, do they have access to hearing aids? I mean, they do pretty well with vision for correction, with vision, but it's more difficult to get effective correction with hearing because of cost.
Yeah. And again, these are self-reported based on one person in the household that feels something. Oh yeah, my father can't hear. Maybe he doesn't want to hear you, So anyway, again, there are opportunities to do studies that are really more intensive and systematic to study a lot of these issues. Disability is a big variable in what we do, really. I mean, people are disabled, somebody has to take care of them. So anything we can learn about it and also do something about it is highly important research. This is women. I'm sorry, let me go back, Tony. He showed me how to do this. Let's see if I can. Okay, this is a very Hispanic origins. We lump Hispanics, and we do that in research sometimes because we don't have enough numbers in the national survey. Well, with the census, we have enough numbers. So we can get a handle on the differences between the various Hispanic origin groups, and you can see the Mexican origin group is fairly disabled. Puerto Ricans are the worst. We knew that actually from little studies, we suspected that. And they seem to be the most disabled in these self-reports. The Cubans are the best though. And what do you see next? Central and South America. They're doing pretty well, right? A lot of it, these are probably recent immigrants. And Carl Eschbach and I, we're going to be looking at the socioeconomic characteristics. We know that Central Americans are poor people. Some of the the South Americans tend to be more professional people. And but these are older people, okay, who may have come earlier in life. They were healthier to begin with. They were selected biologically and also socioeconomically. And the other Hispanic group, I mentioned earlier, that some of these other Hispanic groups may be Mexican origin, or maybe most of them. But they don't want to check Mexican, so they check other Hispanic. Look at them, they look just like the Mexican, at least their disability rates. Another thing we want to do is really take a close look at their socioeconomic characteristics of the other Hispanic groups. This is women, very much the same story. The Puerto Ricans are worse. South Americans seems to be. I'm going to go quickly because you get the sense of the pattern. The Puerto Ricans are the worst off, and maybe the South Americans are the best off. But the Mexicans are close to the Mexican origin, close to the Puerto Rican. Same here, physical. So the pattern that emerges is no surprise to me and those of us who've been studying the minority groups for a long time. But the data are more appropriate in some ways because of the large coverage and large samples. A little less appropriate because of the reliance on self-reports that somebody checks on the census form. But the pattern makes a lot of sense. And there are the Cubans doing reasonably well on the sensory one, and the Mexican and Puerto Rican are being about the same here on the average. Same here with the women. Well, I don't need to show you. This is like a picture of a Hispanic. We have, many of you out there, especially watching, you may not be aware that we have the largest study of the Mexican-American elderly going on. It's been going on for many years now. We're in our 12th year. And we've been following people up for many, many years, and we're learning a lot about their lives, including the cognitive problems that become very important as people become very old. But I'm going to just stop here because I'm running out of time and I'd like for you to have a chance to ask questions.
Any questions from the other sites as well? Anybody, any comments there? Or?
Yes, we do.
Yes, okay, great. Okay. Well, could you please identify yourself and where you're from?
We're at R, and the last page, the EPE stands for Conceptual Model for EPE-SE.
What does it stand for?
Oh, yeah, it's the Hispanic Established Population for the epidemiologic study of the elderly. And it's been going on, 3,050 people. We've been following them up since 93, 94. We're actually in the field now doing an 11-year follow-up. And we're going to get at least 1,000 very old Mexican origin people. We are re-interviewing them and re-examining them, limited assessments. And we're adding another 1,000 people who are also 75 and over, randomly selected from the southwestern states. This study was modeled after 4 other EPIs studies that were done in New Haven, in East Boston, in Fort County area, North Carolina, around Durham, and also in rural Iowa. And there have been really major studies in getting basic information on the health of the population. And we're the latest one that is strictly a Mexican-American study. And it's available, it's archived at the University of Michigan, and it's available. Most of the waves, the first 3 waves of interviews and exams are available for people to download them and look at the numbers and play with them, write papers, publish them. And we encourage that. And we help with that. Yeah. So thank you for asking
Excuse
that.
me. We want to clarify on that. On figure 13, I'm not sure which slide it is, but there's 5 initials, E, P, E, S, E. We want to know what that stands for.
Established.
The letters, what that acronym means.
Established.
Slowly, yeah.
Established population for the epidemiological study of the elderly.
Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I was just talking about, yeah, these large studies. So.
Anybody else? Great. Others? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
All right. This concludes. Please take some time to fill out your evaluation forms. These are real important so we can monitor how we're doing and send reports back to HRSA, and they'll love us and good things like that when we have some feedback. But thank you for coming today. If you have C evaluation forms, you can hand them to me or send them to me or however you want to do that.